So, welcome to Midweek Experiments in Faithfulness. This is a weekly facilitated spiritual practice with a Quaker flavor and an experimental ethos. So, my name is Jen, and I'm the program manager here at Beacon Hill Friends House, where I both live and work. So, the Friends House is a Quaker intentional community of about 20 people who live according to Quaker values. For us, those are faith, simplicity, integrity, community, and social responsibility. We're also a Quaker Center for Learning and Action, and I manage these public-facing programs, which you are now a part. Tonight we have the Reverend Megan McDermott with the practice Filling the Gaps, Poetry as Exploration of Scriptural Silence. So by their very nature, texts that are meaningful or sacred to us will never fully answer the questions we might have for them, or completely portray all the perspectives and possibilities of their characters. Using the Bible and some of her own poems, Megan will lead us in how we might write poetry as a way of exploring what's left unsaid or given little attention to in a text. She will also direct us towards the opportunity to read poetry that explores those silences as well. Megan McDermott is a poet and Episcopal priest living in Western Massachusetts. Her first poetry chapbook, which is a small collection of poems, prayer book for contemporary dating, will be published by Ethel Micropress later this year. And her work has been in a variety of journals, including the Christian Century, Relief, a journal of art and faith, the Cresset, and Rock Sling, a journal of witness. She is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, an interdisciplinary program dedicated to religion and the arts. So again, welcome. We're happy that you've joined us, and Megan, it's all yours.
Good evening, everyone. I am thrilled to be with you tonight and to see both familiar and new faces to me. As Jen said, I'm Megan McDermott, a poet and priest based in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I'm really passionate about the relationship between faith, spirituality, and the arts. So I'm really looking forward to our topic for the night. So I'll be giving an introduction to the practice, and then we're going to have time for everyone to actually write a little bit themselves. And then we'll come back together and talk, share a bit about how that was. I won't make you read your poems if you don't want to, but I hope maybe one or two of you will. So to begin, I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of great reasons to read and write poetry, including kind of a whole litany of reasons that intersect with our spirituality. So tonight, I'm not going to try to get into all the different angles with which poetry connects to our spiritual selves and well-being. I'm really just going to focus on one way that poetry has served as a nourishing spiritual practice in my own life. So I'm just going to pull up some slides. So as the title for this talk states, one way poetry can be used is filling the gaps of what is missing from sacred texts and exploring scriptural silences. So this is a spiritual practice that I think about as being about relationship, namely a dynamic relationship with a text or a story or the figures or characters that make up that text. So for me, one of my religious commitments is pressing into a deeper and more alive relationship with the Bible. So that's going to be the text that I reference today, though I hope that you will feel empowered to take whatever we do tonight and apply it to any narratives or texts that feel sacred or inspiring in your own life. So why poetry, you might be wondering. So of course, your mileage might vary, but I think that poetry is a form of writing particularly well suited to grappling with questions, for reflecting, wrestling, and imagining in organic ways. So you don't have to be, worried about plot and dialogue in the same way that you might with fiction. And this might just be my perspective from a bad nonfiction class in college, but you don't have to be self-conscious about getting all the facts right or needing to make the piece that you're writing more about you than you feel comfortable. There's always some kind of creative distance you can throw in with poetry. So when I was looking for a genre where I could process my own questions about faith and the Bible and Christian identity, poetry turned out to be the ideal way to do that. So the way to know if poetry might have this power for you is to read and listen to it, but also to write it. And I want to make space for both of those things today. So I'm going to offer two of my own poems, since that allows me to better speak to their creation and how I experience that as a spiritual practice. But before the end of the call, I'm going to drop a link in the Zoom chat to a list of 15 poems by a bunch of people who are not me, that I think do a similar work of playing with the gaps and silences in Scripture. And so if you're a newer reader of poetry, I think these poets are a really great place to start and would show, some of the range of what's out there in this type of poetry. So without further ado, here's the first poem that I wanted to share tonight. And so this poem was published a few years ago in Rock Sling, a journal of witness, which has a lot of stories and poems with a spiritual or religious bent. So I wanted to give them a shout out if you are looking for more of that kind of work. So this is called Orpah's Failure. Naomi had often studied Orpah and had frequently observed that beneath her apparent piety, there lurked the unmistakable influence of her former heathen tendencies. Naomi was determined to put Orpah to conclusive test, but when that test came, Orpah failed. She made her choice in favor of the rich and prosperous Moab she knew. This is a quote from All the Women of the Bible by Herbert Lockyer. Yes, give me my own mother's greeting at the door, and her chin pointed like mine, her coo. Give me the chance to grieve without sharing. Men take you from love, though sometimes give it, sometimes die and send you back. In marriage, I'd cobbled together replacements. Ruth like a sister, our secrets coded in laughter. And then Naomi, that oracle of her son's moods, fireside preacher, like a mother, but only like. Told twice I will not refuse her while welcome waits, not when she seeks the gift of undisturbed wallow. I listen to know, first from her, then inside me. Listen to my own feet, walk away honest. So a few words on this example. If you're at all familiar with the book of Ruth, you might know that Orpah is basically just the other one in the story, the one who is not Ruth. She is the daughter-in-law that doesn't stay with Naomi. So the three of them, Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah, they set out to return to Naomi's hometown after all of their husbands have died. But Naomi tells both of the women to go back home. And Ruth, well, she just really obstinately refuses to listen to Naomi. But Orpah just, does what she's asked eventually after an emotional goodbye. And there's really nothing when I read the text that tells me Orpah's a negative figure or a sinful figure, or however you want to kind of frame it. But I think there's a tendency in life and sometimes in the way people talk about the Bible to feel like, if we're saying one person is good or righteous, which is what the book of Ruth is saying about Ruth, then that automatically means this other person, Orpah, who's going down a different path, that she can also be godly or good. And so that was the interpretation of the book of Ruth that really bothered me, what I was really pushing back against in this poem. And so the silence or the gap that this poem is exploring is just who is Orpah really, and what is it that motivates her, which is not included in the text. So this poem is playing with a lot of questions, like, why does Orpah make the choice that she makes? A choice that's different from the choice that Ruth makes. What is it that she's going back to? What does making that decision feel like? And what were her relationships with Naomi and Ruth like prior to this? So that is one example. And I'm just going to do one more poem that I wrote last year, actually, and hasn't really been published anywhere. So I'm excited to share it with all of you. And I apologize, that's probably really hard to read in its current font size. This is called While Jacob Was Wrestling. While Jacob was wrestling, I slept, sweating, and in my own dreams met a wrestler called Choicelessness. She looked like me, but dead-eyed, came alive only to laugh at the idols in my arms. I lunged then, dropping one, and in the tussle broke it in two. Your husband has a God that might do. Your husband a God, husband God. I fought her for hours, begged, bless me, bless me. So this poem is inspired by one of my favorite stories in Scripture of Jacob wrestling with an angel who might also be God in Genesis chapter 32. And in the chapter just before it, we hear that one of Jacob's wives, Rachel, took idols that belonged to her family, the family that she, Jacob, and Leah are in the process of fleeing. And the text doesn't really tell us what Rachel's connection really is to the religion and the gods that she grew up with. Like, why did she take these things in the first place? So that was on my mind as I was wondering, what was Rachel's night like that same night that her husband Jacob was wrestling with God? So he is described as having sent Rachel and Leah across the stream. So Jacob is alone. But what would it be like if Rachel was also doing some wrestling of her own? And what might she have been wrestling with? That was the gap that this poem was trying to fill. And so my mind went to this idea of, a lack of autonomy in her life and in defining her own religious and spiritual practices going forward. So I hope that these examples kind of show what I'm getting at when I talk about poetry exploring silences in Scripture. For some of you, maybe at this point, certain stories, characters, passages, or text outside of the Bible that you love might be coming to mind. Maybe there are instances where you're bothered by a lack of information, where you want to know how someone felt, or what did they do immediately after or before the dramatic story that we still have today. If you're having thoughts like that, I invite you to take a little note for yourself to return to in just a bit. But first, I wanted to give a little more guidance on identifying gaps and silences, in case this is a new way of thinking, or you feel like a little intimidated or stuck by the process. So I have up now a very, very short story from the Gospels. There's a lot of text that could work for the exercise we're about to do. I just chose this one because there's a woman in it, which is maybe a low bar, but tends to be what I gravitate to in my poems about scripture. But at the same time, I've never written about this story before, so I thought it would be fun to explore together. So this is from Mark chapter 1. I pulled out an earlier verse just to give us a little bit of context. So Jesus and the disciples went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. And this is basically all the entire story. We don't get any more info about that. So when I was in college, the Bible studies I went to, we always did this observation phase where before we were allowed to talk about the meaning of the passage, before we were allowed to start, getting all philosophical about what it means for our lives, we just had to point out what was happening, even if that meant kind of stating some really obvious things. So what we're doing tonight is basically that, but flipped around. So we're naming things that aren't said or mentioned in this story, things that are missing, and that could be an opening for a poem or our reflection. So if you're able, I invite you to write into the chat something or multiple somethings that we don't know about what's going on in this story or that aren't mentioned, a gap or a silence that you perceive. And you could phrase that as a question if you want, if that's more helpful. It doesn't have to be phrased that way. It could be something big and serious or silly or small. But if anyone has any that are coming to mind, if you put them in the chat, I'll read off a few of them so we can kind of inspire one another and what this looks like. We don't know how long she's been sick. Simon's wife, ? How long did she have the fever? How bad was it? Did they try anything else to help her? How she felt lying there in her house and having this troop of men wander in on her privacy with an obligation to serve them. Is she the only available woman to serve them? Who else lives in the house? Between the synagogue and entering Simon and Andrew's house, what were they thinking? These are great examples. I'm trying to think if I had any down that you all haven't any already got into. Why Simon and Andrew's house in particular? Did Jesus say anything as he took her by the hand? Had this mother-in-law met Jesus before, or was this a totally new encounter? What was her name? I also myself wondered, Simon Peter's wife, what's her deal? Where is she in this story? Who is she? Did the mother-in-law say anything? So we have a lot of examples that you could come back to in the chat, but I hope that helped to get all of our minds kind of moving in this direction about the things that you can look for when you're encountering any sort of text or story. And naming and identifying a gap is what allows you to really meet that gap with your imagination. Sometimes people have a reluctance about mixing imagination with sacred text or with the spiritual life. But I think there are rich histories of these two things being intermingled. And I really do think when we write in this way, it's not only a creative exercise, but something that's spiritual and religious and theological as well. And so I'm going to screen share again quickly. So I think there are a lot of resonances with what we're about to do and the act of Ignatian contemplation, which is a spiritual practice going back to Ignatius of Loyola, who was a 16th century Jesuit. But I'm just going to read briefly from Father James Martin, a contemporary Jesuit, how he describes Ignatian meditation. So he just describes it as imaginatively placing yourself in a scene, asking yourself, what do I see? What do I hear? What do I feel, taste, and smell? And what I really wanted to pull out in this quote, this is him responding to an interviewer, basically saying, how do you know when it's your imagination? And how do you know when it's like true, serious contemplation and prayer? And he says, God is at work through your imagination. And really, who is to say where one ends and the other begins? And for him, it's more fluid. So I think, while writing poems addressing the gaps in scripture isn't the exact same thing as Ignatian meditation, there are overlaps in that I think both kind of blur the line between imagination and prayer. That's a fluid thing. And lastly, I think the kind of gaps and silences that we choose to fill can be a way of enacting our theological commitments. So much of my work as a poet blossoms out of a feminist theological perspective. So my poems are seeking to really see the women in these stories, and by uplifting their humanity, hopefully uplifting women's humanness in general. So I've been really influenced by the work of a particular feminist theologian, Elizabeth Johnson, who also happens to be a Catholic nun. And I first encountered her works in college. I'm going to read a shorter version of this quote here. Women in the history of Israel, women in the ministry of Jesus, women at the center of the cross and resurrection event, women in the apostolic church, women as prophets, apostles, and leaders of house churches, women martyrs, women ascetics. I'm gonna skip over some of these women. Women in solidarity with each other, seeking equal partnership with men, women preaching, interpreting the Bible, leading others in the ways of the Spirit, peacemaking women, women loving their children, women loving their husbands, women escaping their husbands, women fighting male restrictions on their lives and ministry, women resisting injustice, ordinary women of fidelity and valor, all have been there living their lives before God. To discover these four sisters with their sufferings and defeats, their accomplishments and victories, and to recover their lives from the judgment that labels them insignificant, is to break through a long and debilitating amnesia. And then a little bit later in the book, or this might be earlier in the book actually, she defines feminist theology, saying it interprets Christian tradition so as to uncover what oppresses the full humanity of women in all dimensions of their being, and to release what enhances this, a goal that is inseparable from the truth of the compassionate God to which the tradition testifies. And this is from her book, Friends of God and Prophets, a feminist theological reading of the Communion of the Saints. So I think this work is encouraging a certain kind of historical work and approach to interpreting the Bible, which I think is important. But also we have to face that some histories we no longer have access to, and that the texts we're trying to interpret don't always offer up everything that we need to fully turn towards women's humanity. So as I write at the bottom of this slide, Sometimes imagination is the only or most appropriate option available that we have for recovery of these women's lives and for feminist interpretation. So while I'm talking about a feminist perspective, I think imagination is a lens that womanist theologians, queer theologians, liberation theologians, disability theologians, any theologian working on marginalized perspectives, excluded perspectives, I think all of us use imagination in relation to Scripture. So I encourage you to think about, what are the gaps and silences you really want to see filled because of what's on your heart and because of what you value and believe about God or the world. So finally, we're at the part of the night where I'm going to invite you all to actually write. So we're going to take until 8:15, which I don't think is going to feel like a lot of time. So please just consider that a start to whatever poem might be emerging for you or brewing inside of you. There's no pressure to come up with anything finalized in this time. I'll leave this slide up, which has some directions, encouraging you, if you want to do something on the story we talked about together, using something from the chat, feel free to do that. Feel free to do something about a story that popped into your own mind.